We started looking at the book of Samuel last week. Samuel is a historical book that contains a lot of historical facts and stories and narratives that covers the time between roughly the time of Samson and up through the time of David. And I know we often call it a historical book. Of course, most of you at this point know what I think of the term historical book. While it's true it does contain a lot of history, it's not there for the history. God didn't put it in here just so we have data and facts and stories and narratives and stuff of what happened in that time gap. He puts it in there for a much larger purpose, of course. We said that the caption or the theme of the book of Samuel, I believe, is found in chapter 2. It's Hannah's prayer, where she goes to great lengths to talk about how God raises up and he puts down, and he brings wealth and he brings poverty, and he brings to life and he puts to death. And God's in charge of all these things. And so we see over and over and over throughout the book of Samuel where things go up and things go down. This person is raised up, that person's taken down. This person's given success, this person's given defeat. This person's given wealth and status, and this person is taken down. And over and over throughout the book, we see all these things happening. And to the Jewish people who've received this book, probably we think written right after the time of Solomon, and they look back at their history and all the turmoil that's going on and all the places they've come. How did we get from the time of Judges to where we are here? And now we've just been through Solomon's reign and the kingdom is splitting and what's going on. And so God provides for them this book to show them their history, not only historically how did they get to where they were, but a picture of how God is in charge of all the things that he's sovereign over all the things that have happened. Not that that negates any of their responsibility to obey, because they still have to obey and do what's right, but whether they do or do not, God is still sovereign over it all. And so we see that start to take place, first of all, with Samuel and Eli's sons. Remember, Eli's sons were disobedient. They were not doing what they were supposed to do. They were a bad priest. They should have been the next in line to be priests after Eli, but they were misbehaving. So God took them out and had them killed. And instead, God raised up somebody else, a little boy named Samuel, yeah. And Samuel was a Nazirite all of his life. He grew up dedicated to God for that purpose, and he served God in the temple. And then as he traveled out around, kind of judging the rest of Israel and leading them. And then we got last week to the story about the Ark of the Covenant and the battle with the Philistines. Fascinating story. All the rest of the book of Samuel is kind of about how God interacts with these characters and the characters interact. This story is directly about God interacting with the Philistines directly. And we asked a question, and we said, the Israelites are under judgment from God. They've been, again, misbehaving. They've been involved in idolatry. God has punished them by using the Philistines to oppress them. And so they're in battle, and they choose to bring out the Ark of the Covenant. And the Philistines say, whoa, the Ark of the Covenant came out. We've heard about this God. This is the God that devastated the Egyptians when they brought all the plagues and they walked across the sea, which, by the way, at that point had been about, 500-ish years earlier, and people are still talking about this. So I don't know if you remember back when we covered the book of Exodus, we said God did this to establish his name and his reputation among not just Israel, but all the nations. And here they are 500 years later, still respecting what God did to Egypt. But the Ark of the Covenant comes into the Israelite camp, and the Philistines say, what do we do? We've never had to deal with this before. We've never had to fight a God like this before. And in their minds, the battle just switched. It's no longer the Philistines against the Israelites. It's now the Philistines against the Israelite God. And so if God just loses the battle in the Philistines' mind, what just happened? We, or at least maybe our God, Dagon, the Philistine God, is more powerful than the Israelite God. And so God's reputation and his testimony gets damaged. So what do? You don't want the Israelites to win the battle because they're being punished, but you also don't want to lose the battle or else God's name gets tarnished. What do? If you're God, what do? Well, what he did was he allowed the Israelites to lose, his ark to be captured, and then he defeats the Philistines all by himself. So they bring the ark into the Philistine towns, and God just starts pummeling the Philistines, afflicting them with sicknesses and death and all kinds of... He just basically starts plaguing them kind of like he did the Egyptians, not frogs and gnats and all that kind of stuff. But he just brings disease and plagues and all kinds of things. And so this Philistine town takes the ark and they send it to the next Philistine town, and they start getting plagued. And so they send it to their neighbors. Finally, the neighbors probably start getting angry at each other. Why are you sending this box to us? You just ended up getting decimated, and now you're sending it to us. Thanks a lot. So they get together and say, what do? We have to get this thing back to the Israelites. This God is too powerful for us. He put our God, Dagon, on his face when he put a put him together in the temple. He's afflicting us with all these kinds of plagues. We got to get rid of this thing. It's too powerful for us. So they put it on a car and they sent it back to the Israelites, and it turns out the Philistines had more respect for the Israelite God oftentimes than what the Israelites themselves did. So we're going to continue the story this morning, see more examples of God's sovereignty and how he deals in the affairs of people. We also said that Samuel deals with and shows us, illustrates for us, how God's character and his laws and his commands play out in real life. Throughout the law, we have God giving us his direct commands: thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do this, here's how you treat people, here's how you solve problems, etc., etc. And it's very instructional, and that makes sense, and that's all fantastic, and that's good, but real life is confusing, real life is messy, real life is hectic, and the book of Samuel kind of shows us how God's laws and his character and his judgments play out in real life, in the chaotic, competitive, deceitful, tricky, confusing times of real life, and how it looks like and it plays out in real life. So we're going to see more of that today as well. We get to chapter 8. This is just after the ark is sent back to the Philistines. Samuel is judging the nation of Israel, but the people are getting tired of just having judges, one judge after another, and they say the solution to this is what? We're tired of having judges. We're tired of being kind of a loose confederacy of tribes who kind of stick together, but sometimes we kind of war against each other, and we don't always cooperate, and there's not a lot of communication, and it's a really chaotic time. We're tired of being overthrown. We need an enemy. We need somebody to kind of create an army for us so we can coordinate and go out and fight our enemies better. We need some kind of centralized leadership. Right? We need what's the word? We need a king to govern us. And so they go to Samuel and they say, look, Samuel, chapter 8, verse 1, when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. And his plan was to make them the next judges and continue on. The name of the firstborn was Joel, the name of the second was Abijah, and they were judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways, but they turned aside after gain. They took bribes and they perverted justice. They were not of the character that their dad was, of Samuel. And it almost reminds me of what Eli ran into, the priest, right? Eli was maybe mediocre at best, but his sons were even worse. And now Samuel, he's fantastic, and he's doing what's right, and he's following God, and he's leading Israel, but his sons, they're just not. And probably the Israelites look at this and they say, judges are hard enough to live under even when it's a good judge. But when they're bad judges and they're running around and they're corrupt and they're taking bribes, and we just can't have this. We want something else. So they say, we need a king. And Samuel goes to them and says, I don't think that's really what you want. We covered this chapter earlier in the book of Judges. Remember when we referenced Gideon, but we'll cover it again here quickly. Samuel goes to God and says, God, they're asking for a king, and this is a problem. This is not really the system that you set up. They weren't supposed to ask for a king. And God says to Samuel, don't worry, Samuel, they're not rejecting you as a leader. It's not because you're doing a bad job. Really what they're doing is rejecting me. Well, what does that have to do with asking for a king? What does asking for a king have to do with rejection of God? Well, because if you remember from Deuteronomy, the way Deuteronomy is set up is a treaty between Israel and God. God is the ruling party, the king, and the people are to be the subject people, the subjects of the kingdom. So God was to be their king. So when they go to God and say, God, we want a king, what they're really saying is, God, we don't want only you to be our king anymore. We want a people king so that we can be like all the other nations and have an army and have a king and have a government and all that kind of stuff. We don't want to be special like you wanted us to be anymore. We want to be just like everybody else. God says, oh, well, that's too bad. In chapter 8, Samuel starts to warn the people what a king will be like. I'll give you a king, but here's what he's going to be like. He's going to take your children to serve him. He's going to take your fields. He's going to take your flocks. Basically, the gist of the passage is he's going to inflict some massive taxes on you. That's kind of what it comes down to. He's going to take the best of everything you have, tax it for himself to sustain his own government, and you guys at some point are going to wish that you had no king again because of all the bad decisions they'll make and all the taxation, everything they take from you. And at that time, God says, I will not hear your pleas anymore. He says, you have asked for this. I'm telling you up front what this is going to be like and the problems it will cause. You're saying, I don't care, give us one anyway. And so when you say someday, we made a mistake, we don't want a king anymore, God says, it's too late. You've got it now. You demanded it. You get what you asked for. And so in chapter 8, verse 17, it says, he will take the tenth of your flocks, and you will be his slaves, talking about their own king. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Verse 19, but the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we might be like all the other nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And when Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice and make them a king. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, go every man to his own city. And so Samuel starts to look for the first king. God, of course, tells him who to anoint. We're going to have to paraphrase a lot of this because we need to make some good time going through Samuel, so we'll paraphrase. God tells Samuel to go down to a man of the tribe of Benjamin, the son of Kish. And there's a guy down there, God says, that I want you to anoint. Meanwhile, Saul and his servant, his guy, are out looking for a pack of donkeys, of all things. Some donkeys had wandered away. So they're wandering through the countryside looking for the donkeys. They get to Ramah, which is Samuel's town. They say, yeah, I think I heard there's a prophet here. I think Samuel lives up here. Let's go ask him where our donkeys are. How's that for a great use of a prophet of God? Here's a quarter, tell us where our donkeys are. But that's the plan. So they go up to see Samuel, and the donkeys become afterthought because Samuel says, hey, I want to have dinner with you later, and I got a special message for you. So they go to dinner with Samuel. Samuel says, guess what? You're going to be the next king. What do you think of that? Oh, says Samuel, that's kind of surprising. I'm not sure what to do with that. And so he gives him some signs, and he goes on his way, and Saul eventually becomes the next king. Chapter 10, verse 17. Now Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah, and he said to the people of Israel, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the hands of the Egyptians and from the hands of all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today you have rejected your God, who saves you from all of your calamities and distresses. And you have said to him, set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your thousands. So they go through this whole lot drawing thing. They start by tribe and by clan and by family, and they narrow it down. Finally, Saul is chosen out of his family. Verse 24, Samuel said to all the people, do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? There's none like him among all the people, because he's tall and he's attractive and he's strong and he's kingly looking and all that kind of thing. All the people shouted, long live the king! But some people didn't want him to be the king. So the people have rejected officially God as their king. God has granted them another king. But they're not only just rejecting the law and God's kingship, are they? And this kind of occurred to me as I was going through and preparing this. What are the people also saying? Why did the system of the judges and having God as their king, why did that really not work? I mean, the people looked at God and his law and said, no, we want an actual king. God's rejected his king. But even beneath that, what's the root cause, for you analytical people, what's the root cause of really what's going on here? What are they really saying? What they're saying is the system we've been living under, God's Deuteronomic system, the Mosaic law, all of this is not working. Why was it not working? Was it a fault of God's law? Was it faulty? I see head shaking no. Good. I'm glad you at least figured that out. That's encouraging. So what went wrong there? Where's the flaw? Where's the problem in this system? The problem is that the people, the subjects, what? Would not obey. They wouldn't obey it. And they're finding out for themselves the hard way that the law of Moses, the law itself, it can't provide, it's lacking, it's insufficient somehow. We cannot be a good and righteous people under the law alone. Isn't that really what they're saying? God's law in itself isn't sufficient. We need somebody to enforce and make us be good people, because left to our own selves, if we are under our own responsibility with no central government and king and all that kind of stuff, left to ourselves under the law, we will disobey and rebel every single time. This is not working. We need some kind of something else to make us behave. I look at that and I think, wait a minute. Law, insufficient, not capable of bringing out personal change and obedience in our lives. That sounds familiar to me. Where else have we seen that from our perspective today? Where have we seen that else in the Scripture? Oh, I see a hand. I love hands. Yes, sir.
Pauline epistles.
What? Yeah, that sounds familiar from the New Testament, doesn't it? We've seen this before. When God actually provides a better system, and he himself comes out and says, the law that I gave you earlier, it was not flawed. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the law, but it wasn't complete. It cannot bring about personal change and obedience and dedication to God. You need something better. And so God says, I have provided you something better than the law. So I sent somebody to fulfill the law, and I give you something better, the Holy Spirit and my salvation to you. In fact, in Galatians chapter 3 is kind of, amongst other passages, you could turn to several. Chapter 3 of Galatians, verse 19. Why then the law? Why give the law? It was added because of transgression until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made, and it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. God says the law was put into place to make you aware of your sin, and it was to tell you what was right and wrong until I could provide the ultimate answer. It continues in verses 23 through 26 of the same chapter. Now before faith came, before Christ and salvation and all that came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned until the coming faith would be revealed. So then the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian, or I think your King James says schoolmaster, a teacher. We're no longer under that teacher or guardian or schoolmaster, for in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith. The law was provided, but it couldn't really provide the change of spirit that is really necessary to follow God on our own character. But now that the law has been fulfilled and we have that salvation and we're changed from the inside out, now we no longer need the law because we have our own spiritual guidance if we are walking by the Spirit and obeying what God says. Now we have that and we don't need the law. But back then, before the ultimate answer came, God had given them the law. And sure enough, just like God says in Galatians and in other portions of the New Testament, what were the Israelites finding out for themselves? The law in and of itself, if it's left up to us to do what's right and follow God and be obedient to Him, the law in and of itself is what? It's insufficient. And so while the people were sinning by asking for a king because they rejected God as their king, at the same time they were admitting, under the law, we are not good enough to follow and obey the law. We cannot do it. Because our society, we disobey, we turn to idolatry, our society falls apart, everything's a mess, we're in chaos. We are too disobedient to follow the law on our own because we're just too sinful. It's not sufficient to change us from the inside out. It can tell us what to do from the outside in, but we're too rebellious and too disobedient to follow it, and so it's not good enough for us. That's also what the people were saying. Does that make sense? Everybody okay? Everybody good? You see where we're going? Okay. And so the people say, we reject God as king, not just because we're rebellious, which they were, and not just because they were disobedient, which they were, but also because the law, and they were not good enough to follow the law and be successful doing it. And they were, whether they realized it or not, they were tacitly admitting that they were not capable of following the law, and it could not save them in and of itself. And I think we all looking back and say, well, yeah, it's because you need something better. But back then they didn't have the better yet, and so their only idea was to say, well, what the answer we really need is to ask for a human king to help enforce these laws and make us from the outside in be better people. And that's kind of what they're hoping for, at least in terms of social structure and fighting, all this kind of stuff. And probably even at this time they weren't even thinking in terms of moral behavior. Probably they're just thinking in terms of social survival. Probably at this point, but they're saying, yeah, we're not good enough to follow the law. And so Saul is appointed as king. things happen. They go into battle. Saul wins the battle. Everybody's excited. Yay, we have a king. See, this is a great system. We knew asking for a king was a good idea, they say. Samuel, in chapter 12, kind of gives his farewell address. This is not his I'm dying right now, but this is kind of his retirement speech, if you want to think of it like that. Samuel says, you now have a king. You no longer need a judge because you have demanded a king, and so you don't need a judge anymore. So I'm not going to be the judge like you're used to. I'll still be around. In fact, he was around to anoint David and intermediate between Saul and David for a while. But he says, as a judge, now you have a king, and so I'm kind of stepping down. He says, I hope you two are very happy together, you and your kingship. And so Saul goes out. He fights some Philistines. And once again, we see some of the same things coming up. But verse 7, they've not rejected you, God says to Samuel, but they've rejected me. So in this chapter, the people demand a human king, officially rejecting Yahweh as their king. So although the law is still in effect, it's not the close treaty relationship that God had intended to have with Israel. From now on, the nation's obedience or disobedience to God would depend largely on one man. Now again, there can be individuals still obeying even in a wicked society. We understand that. We looked at that in the book of Ruth. But the nation as a whole, their obedience depends to a large degree on one man, isn't it? That man is now the king. So if you have a good king who is obedient to God, everything should be great. In fact, Samuel says that. If the king obeys, fine and well. But if he doesn't, things are going to get kind of ugly. After Saul had been made king, Samuel reminds the people of the wickedness of their own request in the end of chapter 12. And we won't take time to read that. You can read that for yourself because we have to keep moving. But again, throughout the stories of Saul and Samuel here, in chapters 7 through 15, we see more of God's sovereignty taking place and playing out. God chooses and anoints Saul as king, and he raised him up from a shepherd's son and makes him king over Israel. God picks somebody out of obscurity, and he raises him up to national prominence and leadership. In chapter 14, we also see God supernaturally giving victory to Saul's son, Jonathan, and his armor bearers. They go and they start fighting the Philistines, and God raises them up, and gives them a victory as well. But what God raises up, he can also, take down as well. And we see some of that happening also. In chapter 13, we see God taking Saul's kingdom. Chapter 13, verse 8, Saul's getting ready to fight yet another battle. Samuel said, you go on down there, wait for 7 days, I'll be there, we'll make a sacrifice, we'll not earn God's favor, but we'll ask for God's favor in battle, we'll get his instructions, and off we go. So verse 8 of chapter 13, he waited 7 days until the time appointed by Samuel. But Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. Again, put yourself in Saul's boots here. He's got a big battle to fight. The enemy is huge. Everybody's nervous. They're all waiting there for Samuel. Samuel doesn't show up. The Israelite army is getting nervous. They're defecting left and right. And every day, Saul looks out at his army, and it gets a little smaller and a little smaller because the people are just defecting left and right. Saul says, I've got to do something or I'm going to have no army left. And so he decides, I just got to take matters into my own hands, don't I? I got to do something. And so Saul says, bring the burnt offering here to me and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offerings himself. As soon as he had finished the burnt offerings, behold, who walks around the corner? Samuel does. And Saul went out to meet him and greet him. And Samuel said, what have you done? Samuel said, well, when I saw that the people were scattering from me and that you didn't come within the days appointed and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, gathered, and that's not like the yellow stuff you put on hamburgers, the mustard at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down to me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. We're going to be in battle, and we haven't asked God's favor yet. Everybody knows we need God's favor to have victory, right? So I went ahead and did it myself. So I forced myself, Saul says. Don't you love how he words this stuff? I didn't want to, but I made me do it. I had no choice but to make me do it. It's not my fault. Saul made me do it, Saul says. I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. Verse 13, Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You've not kept the command of the Lord your God which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal, and the rest of the people went up after Saul to meet the army. So God here says, look, this was a kind of a test for you, and you have failed. You've proven that when the heat is turned on and everybody gets nervous, at the end of the day, you're going to follow what you want to do, and you're going to disobey whatever God says. That's not the way a king should behave in this society, under God. That's not what God's looking for. You've proven today that you trust in yourself more than you trust in God, is what it comes down to. You disobeyed God when the heat was on, and now God says, I will discontinue your dynasty from you. You could have had an everlasting, ongoing, your son will be king and his son will be king, on and on and on, but because of this, you will have no dynasty now. God's taken that away from you. And in chapter 15, we see again, Saul goes into battle against the enemy again, the Agagites here, and he defeats them. God gives victory, but God said, you are to go in and you are to destroy everything. Kill them all, he says. Chapter 15, verse, where am I at? Verse 3, now go down and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox, sheep, camel, donkey, all the people, all the men, all the women, all the children, all the animals, all the livestock, everything dead, gone. Kill them all, take no prisoners, no sacrifices. Destroy them, completely destroy them. So Saul goes in, he has victory, but he makes a mistake, doesn't he? He miscalculates a little bit. And so he kills all the undesirable stuff, but some of the stuff he keeps. Verse 7, Saul defeated the Amalekites as far as Shur, but he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. Killed all the people, but he kept the king. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fatted calves, and of the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless, they devoted to destruction. The word of the Lord came to Samuel, verse 10 and 11. I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. And Samuel was angry, and he cried to the Lord all night. And Samuel rose to meet Saul in the morning, and it was told to Samuel, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set up a monument for himself. Isn't that nice? It gives a little insight into Saul's mindset. He set up a monument to himself. And he turned and passed on and went down to Gilgal. So Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, Blessed be you to the Lord. I've performed the commandment of the Lord. Aren't you proud of me, Samuel? Look what I've done. I've had victory in battle. I've done just what you said. Everything's grand. Verse 14, Samuel said, Oh, really? Could you say that again a little louder? Because I couldn't hear what you said above all of the lowing of the oxen and all the sheep. That the livestock that I hear are too loud. Could you repeat that thing where you said, I've followed your command? Verse 14, Samuel said, Then what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen that I hear? Saul said, They've brought them from the Amalekites. For the people, who did it? Wait a minute, who did this again? Oh, the people, those ornery people. The people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God. But the rest we devoted to destruction. Then Samuel said to Saul, Stop. I will tell you what the Lord said to me this night. And he said to him, Speak. Samuel said, Though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of all the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel. And the Lord sent you on a mission and said, Go, devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they're consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you pounce on the spoil and do what was evil in the sight of the Lord? Why would you do this, Saul? Why would you not obey? Saul makes his excuses in the next couple verses. Samuel continues in verse 22. Samuel said, Has the Lord great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? That's the well-known verse that we know. In other words, is God pleased in sacrifices? Is that really what he's looking for? Or is he looking for obedience and devotion to himself? Obviously, the answer is devotion to himself. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandment of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Now therefore, please pardon my sin and return with me that I may bow before the Lord. But Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. And we can see here that because of his disobedience, because of his arrogance, his neglect for what God says, I brought you up, I raised you up from being a shepherd boy, and now you're king, but now you're disobeying me as king, you're leading the people astray, you're not honoring me, and I'm going to take you right back down to where I got you. You will not be king anymore. And while the first time it seems that God is saying, I'm rejecting your legacy, you could have had generations of kings come from you, now I'm not only rejecting your legacy, but you personally, I will take you down, and you can't be king anymore. Now that takes a few years to play out. He has to raise up David first. But God's rejecting Saul as king here. Whew. And that brings us to the end of chapter 15. But again, we can see the sovereignty of God, again, the theme of the book playing out. God raises Saul up and he takes him down. That brings us to the next section that we want to look at, chapters 16 through 31, where we start to introduce David as well. Because Saul is rejected as king, God needs to appoint a new king. And so we all know the story. I'll not read it verbatim, but Samuel is sent to the house of Jesse, right, of the tribe of David, the family of David, the tribe of Judah. And so God sends him there, and Samuel shows up, and he says this is kind of incognito here, so Saul doesn't get too upset, but we're going to interview all your boys. So he says, Jesse, bring out all your boys. And so he parades them through, and they start with the oldest, and Samuel looks at the first one and says, oh, this has to be the one. He's tall, he's beautiful, he's muscular, he's attractive. This has to be the king. And God tells Samuel what? The famous verse. He says, not that one. You're looking on the outside, just like you did for Saul. But God looks at people a little differently, he says. You're looking on the outside, making your evaluation, but God looks at the heart on the inside in adoration of the people. He's going to start surpassing me if I'm not careful. And so there's a jealousy that starts to arise. And so Saul starts kind of covertly trying to dislodge David, take him down a little bit. He puts him in charge of 1,000 and sends him out to fight the Philistine battles, thinking he's going to get killed in battle and my David problem is over. But his situation then is David is victorious. And he comes back, not only is he not dead, the way that Saul wanted, but now he's gained victory and he has even more notoriety. And so Saul says, I know what to do. I'll offer him my daughter in marriage and say that he has to go out and fight the Philistines to get her hand. So he does that. And again, he's not killed by the Philistines. In fact, he has victory over the Philistines. So now he marries Saul's daughter, and now he's even part of the family, which gives him even more credibility. And David just keeps rising and rising and rising, and Saul just keeps getting more nervous and nervous and nervous, and he kind of, in the eyes of the people, starts sinking down again. And what are we starting to see play all over again? Another one of these things where God is starting to take down just like he said he would, and he's starting to raise up somebody else just like he said he would. Saul starts to try to kill David multiple times. He tries to pin him to the wall with his spear. Jonathan gets wind of this, and he picks up on this, and he says, David, you got to get out of here. My dad's trying to kill you. David refused to see it. He says, nah, it's okay. So they set up a little test. Saul fails the test. He blows his top, and he gets angry. And Jonathan says, you're right. You have to get out of here and go on the run. And so David goes on the run. On and on and on. So David is running from Saul, and Saul starts chasing him, and he's running for his life, and a couple times David spares Saul's life, and Saul feels bad for a little bit, and he goes home, and then he gets jealous, and he goes after him again. All kinds of different stories going on that we clearly don't have time to read all of them. What ones do I even want to look at here? Saul pursues David. David spares his life again. In chapter 25, Samuel dies then. He no longer has Samuel's guidance. They mourn for him. David encounters a guy named Nabal. He's kind of on the run. He's living in the back country, but they have to live somewhere, and so they wander through the countryside. David and his band of merry men, his little warrior group, his ragtag bunch of kind of social rejects, really is kind of what they were in a sense. And they're all following after David. They're kind of displaced, and they're a little disgruntled is kind of the feeling I get. But they're following David. So they're living in the countryside, and they kind of live in and amongst the same territory as this guy Nabal and his shepherds, and they're taking care of their sheep, but they kind of act as a protection so nothing gets stolen or nobody attacks them when they're out in the pastures. And David says, hey, look, we've done all this for you. Can you give us a little bit of something to feed my men? Nabal says, no, I'm not helping you. I'm not giving you anything. And so David gets mad, and he says, I'm gonna go kill that ungrateful guy. And so he bands up and he starts taking off towards Nabal's house. And his wife, Nabal's wife, Abigail, hears about it. He says, oh, with all due respect, what kind of a moron my husband is. He's just irritated this warrior David guy. Everybody knows David. He's fierce. And now he's mad at us and he's headed our way. So Abigail gets a bunch of stuff together on the donkeys and she heads out and she meets him halfway and she pacifies David. She says, I'm sorry for what my husband said, but I'm sure glad that God sent me to you to keep you from taking revenge by your own hand. She says this really, honestly, a brilliant thing. And she's absolutely right. And David kind of stops and he says, you're right. I was going to react in haste and take vengeance in my own hands. Vengeance is God's. That's his department. I shouldn't be doing that. Thank you so much for stopping me. And you're absolutely right. So he takes the gifts. Abigail returns on home. And once again, God has put up and he's taken down. So he looks at Nabal, what he's done, says, Nabal, I think we're done with you. So Nabal dies just a couple days later. Abigail goes back and she marries David. On and on. Again, I can't recount all these stories just for time, but all the different things happen. And so we see all the drama that goes on in David's life as he vies between Saul and David, and God just slowly taking Saul down and raising David up. But what we see again in this section, God shows us the transition between Saul's kingdom and David's kingdom, which was to come. We continue to see God's sovereignty as he gradually takes the kingdom from Saul while protecting and building up David, just as he promised through Samuel. We also begin to see the contrast between what a good king looks like, though, and what a bad king looks like, Saul. We start to see some of the things that David, even though he's not king, some of the things that he does, some of the ways he behaves, some of the things he values, some of the things he does not. And we can contrast that to what we see in Saul's life. And again, we said before, God is not teaching right and wrong here the same way that he did in the law, but we do see it start to play out in real life, don't we? We see some of the things that God values be reflected in David's life. Some of the things that God values not being reflected in Saul's life. Some things surprise us a little bit in the things that David does and how he behaves. And we look for God's reaction to those. Sometime it'd be fun to do a quarter maybe just on this whole section and look at the different activity of David and really evaluate him and think about him a little bit. But we can ask some questions to ourselves as we read through this section. And again, we've just really, really breezed through it here this morning. We don't have time to go into detail, but at home it'd be fun and instructive and intuitive and enlightening maybe for you to go through and read this on your own. Think about the different stories. How would God see this situation? How does David see this situation? How does Saul see this situation? What is the difference between the two? Now, David did some throughout his life, some pretty shady stuff. We all think of the whole Bathsheba situation, and that's certainly a big one for sure. We'll get to that later. But he did some other stuff that we look at and say, that's kind of interesting. That's kind of on the edge of what we might think is being okay. Is that okay? Is that not okay? David seems to think it's okay, but just because David says it's okay doesn't mean it's okay. How does God react to what David does? How does God react to what Saul does? How does God react to Saul's response to David and David's response to Saul? Some of the things it's interesting to look at. So what's the difference between the two? Besides just the individual decisions they make, what are the underlying philosophies of both of them? And I think that really gets more at the heart of what differentiates the two. Both Saul and David end up doing some good things and some bad things each, don't they? So what makes one a man after God's own heart who inherits a dynasty and the other one to be rejected as king? If they both do good stuff and they both do bad stuff, what's the difference? Again, we don't really have time. That's a huge question, by the way. We don't have time to address it here at all. But your homework assignment over the summer, since, by the way, for the summer, we're going to discontinue the Old Testament for a while. We're going to have a different topic for the summer. You get to hear somebody else up here instead of me. Yay! You can all rejoice later when I'm not here. But over the summer, your homework assignment is to go through Samuel and look at these stories and think about them. What is it about David that really pleases God so much that he puts him in this position? What is it about David that makes him a man after God's own heart? For all the weird stuff he does, he goes and he eats the holy showbread that wasn't really for him to eat. He takes a sword. He lies to the priest about why he's there. Did you realize that? He does these things. Later on, he does census stuff that he shouldn't have done, all kinds of stuff. What is it, though, under all that makes David a man of God's own heart, that God blesses him in this way? Or does it have anything to do with David at all? Is it just God's sovereign choice? Huge questions for us to ask, but great things to think about. Why, of all people, did God choose David to be the next king? Why would God choose David? Was David the only righteous man in all of Israel? What do you think? Was he the only one in all of Israel who was wanting to follow God? However many million people lived in Israel at that time, I don't even know. Was he the only one? Did God look all over Israel and say, wow, I can only find one guy that wants to serve me, so I guess he's my next king because I got no other choice? I kind of doubt it. I'm pretty sure there were other people somewhere. So why did God choose David of all the people? I'm going to have to just tease you with that question. I'm going to have to leave you to yourself to answer that because it's 9:42. Okay? But read through these stories. Really analyze them. What was it about David? And he was a man after God's own heart. And just to summarize a little bit, I think beneath some of these superficial decisions that he made was an underlying philosophy that I really ultimately want to please God and I want to follow him. And sometimes he cut corners a little bit and he did some things. And how bad those things were, we'll leave for another discussion at another time. But at the end of the day, I think he really wanted to follow God and do what was right. And when he was confronted with his own wrongdoing, what did he do? Saul made excuses. I made me do it. The people made me do it. It's okay. It's not that big a deal. David, on the other hand, seemed to have a different response, didn't he? When really confronted with doing wrong, he said, I'm not sure I should have done that. Or when he's in a cave with Saul, I could take him out right now. God already anointed me as king. This is my chance. And all of his guys were saying, take the chance. God handed him to you. And God says, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to spare his life because, why? Because Saul's a big, tough king and he'll probably have his army after me? It didn't have anything to do with Saul at all, did he? Saul had David's respect, not because of anything Saul did, but because, what? Come on, think about this. What did he say? Because God appointed him. Me attacking Saul isn't me attacking Saul. Me attacking Saul is me attacking the guy that God says is in charge. And if I attack Saul, I'm taking down God's guy, and so I'm in effect attacking God's decision. And I respect and I fear God too much. I want to follow him. So even if Saul himself is a loser and a bad guy, loser is kind of my term, I threw that in there. But if he is a bad, wicked guy, even if he's a bad, wicked guy, he's still God's choice because God set him up, so God should be the one to take him down, not me. Do you see the respect for who God is there in his philosophy? And I think it's that same underlying philosophy that really makes him the man after God's own heart. So David cuts corners sometimes, and he says and does things a little iffy sometimes. He goes and he pretends to be insane as he lives among the Philistines. And he goes out and he attacks neighboring people, and he goes back and he tells the Philistine king who he's living with that he's been attacking the people of Israel. He lies to him straight up. And the Philistine king says, oh, great, that's good. Now they really hate you, so you'll be more loyal to me. But he lied about it. Is that okay to go back and lie to the king? Is it okay to live in the land of Philistines? Is it okay to take the bread that you shouldn't be eating? Is it okay to lie to the priest while you're there on a secret mission for the king? Or is all that stuff okay? Should that disqualify him from being God's chosen king or a man after God's heart? Apparently not. Whew, fascinating question. See what I mean about life is messy, but there's decisions and there's values? Did I just get myself in trouble here for saying this stuff? Hopefully not. You can chew me out later. That's fine. Read through Samuel on your own. We got to keep moving because it's 9:46. Really, the story of David and Saul goes through the end of what we call 1 Samuel. Next week, we're going to pick up the book of 2 Samuel. We're going to try to cover the entire book in one day. I think we can do it. We'll do a lot of paraphrasing and summarizing again. But again, look through it, read through it, keep looking for God's sovereignty throughout, and keep looking through the heart of God through all the actions of the people and evaluating them. Because we live in just as messy of a world as David and Saul did. We really do. And we try to do what's right too, and things are conflicting. And I just think it's very informative to read through. We got to quit. We'll continue next week. Dear God, we thank you again for this book, for all these stories, so much more than just history. You didn't teach us this just to tell us what happened back then or stories for our entertainment's sake. You put this here so that we can see the behaviors and the values of the people involved and how you respond to them and what your values are and how they all fit together. Help us to learn more about you and how we're to live for you by the way that they behaved and how they tried or not tried to live for you as well. Help us to see more of who you are from this book and these stories. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Thank you very much. One more week, and we'll be done with Samuel. You're dismissed.